Alright, so this is chapter 32, Societies at Crossroads, aka basically everything for three major empires just goes south. These will be the Ottomans, the Tokugawa Shogunate, and the Qing Dynasty. So basically, at the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Russians, the Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, Qing Dynasty, and Tokugawa Japan discovered through wars and confrontations that they were significantly weaker than the modernizing West, as well as India. They all attempted defensive modernization from the top down. So the Ottomans reached their peak military expansion in the late 17th century, with Suleiman at the gates of Vienna 1529. You also have another but weaker Ottoman attack in 1689. However, the Ottoman Empire would not. However, the glory days of the Ottoman Empire were over. The diverse nature of its conquered regions contributed to a desire for independence for the many different ethnicities. It's not just, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just Turks, it was also Arabs and Eastern Europeans and the Balkans. Also, European advances in technology and strategy led to major military Ottoman defeats. The elite Janissary Corps that were involved in palace, that were supposed to be the best troops in the Ottoman Empire, were all end up contributing to its downfall by being involved in palace intrigue and coups, and they frequently neglected military innovation and training. You also highly conserved ulama and massive amounts of corruption and misuse of tax revenues. So the Ottomans begin to lose their territories to Russia and Austria-Hungary, and when you start losing territories to countries like Russia and Austria-Hungary, you're doing very terribly. There are national uprisings in the Balkans drive the Ottomans out, for example, Greece and Serbia. Napoleon is unsuccessfully attacks on Napoleon's unsuccessful attack on Egypt spurs a local revolt against the Ottomans led by Muhammad Ali. He is nominally subordinate to the Sultan, but establishes himself as the effective ruler of Egypt. He modeled his army after Europe, and the only reason why he lost was because the British supported the Ottomans over Ali's advances in order to avoid Russian expansion. Basically, an exercise in the balance of power. So, the imports of cheap manufactured goods end up placing stress on local artisans, resulting in urban riots. They also lost a land-based trade to the east as the maritime trade was basically just cut out the Ottomans from making massive trade revenues. The commodity export-dependent economy increasingly relies on foreign loans to get by, so they have a dependency problem. By 1882, they're unable to even pay interest on the loans. 50% of the budget goes to service their loans, and thus they're forced to accept foreign administration of their debts. You also have capitulations, like China's unequal treaties, granting extraterritoriality, which basically agreements that exempt the Europeans from Ottoman law. They also gave a tax-free status to foreign banks and businesses. So the resulting declining income led to reduced morale, recruitment difficulties, and a rise of corruption. There were some attempts at reform, such as regarding taxation, increasing agricultural output, and reducing corruption. One sultan even managed to model his army on European lines, but the Janissaries revolt killed the new troops and imprisoned the sultan. This is an example of the Janissaries being the so-called elite Janissaries being a burden more than a benefit. Another Sultan, Muhammad II, attempts the same, and as the Janissaries massacre in 1826. He also reformed schools, taxation, and the postal service. By the time of his death in 1849, the Ottoman Empire was smaller, but it was more efficient. You had the Tanzimat or Reorganization era from 1849 to 1876. It was like China's self-regulating, strengthening movement. The pace of reform accelerates, especially in the military, legal, and educational realms. Their equality before the law is granted for all subjects. You have public trials in civil courts, and however, this undermined the power of the traditional religious elite, or the ulama. A constitution representative government is adopted in 1876, but it's suspended within the year. Many liberals are exiled or executed. From 1877 to 1909, you have an ineffective autocracy. From 1909 to 1982, the Young Turk era. It was founded by Ottomans in exile in Paris, who called for rapid secular reforms. They forced the Sultan to restore parliament, then dethroned him in favor of a figurehead. From 1908 to 1918, Ottoman sultans reigned, but they had no power. They have really no power, kind of like today's emperor of like the emperor of Japan in modern day Japan, and the royal family of Britain. The Young Turks attempted to establish Turkish ethno-linguistic hegemony over the far-flung empire. This, for example, they made the Turkish the official language. Despite the large numbers of Arabic and Slavic language speakers, unsurprisingly, this, didn't end very well. It aggravated the relationship between the Turks and the subjects outside of Anatolia, almost kind of like, Aurangzeb of Mughal India. Rebellions follow, and the Ottomans lose even more territory. The Europeans intervened because they didn't want to upset the balance of power, because no matter how weak the Ottomans were, they at least provided a nice buffer against Russian expansion. Basically, Ottomans became the sick man of Europe. So, Russia, if you don't know, was and still is, to some extent, a vast multicultural state. At this time, only approximately half of the people speak Russian and observe Russian Orthodox Christianity. The Roman czars ruled this autocratic empire, and they refused political reform. You had a powerful class of nobles exempt from taxation and military duty, they can have all these privileges as long as they support the czar. You also had exploiters serfdom, with the serfs being able to be bought and sold. Basically, it was slavery in all but name. In the Crimean War, the Russians attempted to expand into the Caucasus in a larger attempt to establish control of the weakening Ottoman Empire. This threatens to upset the balance of power. So Britain and France joined forces with the Ottoman Empire to prevent Russian expansion. Russia is driven back from Crimea in a humiliating defeat. Basically, the Russian Empire could hold its own against the Qing, Ottomans, and Napoleon, but now European military is more and more advanced. Also demonstrated Russian weakness in the face of Western technology and strategy. So, serfdom was a major source of rural instability and, riots. So, Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs in 1861, however, this does not alleviate poverty nor land hunger. He basically wanted to avert revolution. It brought freedom to serfs, but few political rights. The peasants were disappointed by the privileges of freedom that left them in debt for the rest of their lives. This did not significantly increase agricultural production. There were limited attempts to reform administration with small-scale representative government. The Tsar pushed reform as a way to enhance Russia's military power. Freeing serfs was partly a way to provide a cheap labor force. Count Sergei Witt finally has some success after 1880. He orders the Trans-Siberian Railroad, banking savings reform, protected tariffs, and foreign investment. But there's massive discontent among workers. The working conditions are as bad as Britain's were in 1820, so yeah, not great. It didn't help the fact that the trade unions and strikes were outlawed, and they would be crushed with shocking brutality. The growing business class profited as the foreign investors, so they supported the autocracy. The intelligentsia class spreads radical ideas for social change, primarily socialist and anarchist. They use terror tactics and assassinations. Their attempts at more peaceful reform, mainly because their attempts at more peaceful reform were crushed. They failed to connect with the mistrustful peasantry. The Tsarist authorities decide, to crush them, decide to use censorship, a secret police, and imprison or exile people to Siberia. Great. This is a classic tactic to use against your enemies in Russia. Just exile them to the most useless piece of land, to some of the most useless and uninhabitable land in Russia. However, this doesn't stop other tensions. For example, you have national seething in the Baltics, Poland, Ukraine, Georgia, and Central Asia. In fact, actually, if you want to know, these nationalist sentiments would help lead to the break of the Soviet Union, almost in 1990, would help in 1991. So, in order to stop this, the Russian czars suppressed local languages and reserved education only for loyalists. Yeah, not a great idea. You also get some really ugly, widespread pogrom attacks on Jews. In 1881, the radicals assassinated the reformer Tsar Alexander II. This brought in a new Tsar who basically just increased repression. Nicholas II, Nicholas II tries to use expansion in the East to deflect discontent. He enters into war with Japan, and this results in a humiliating defeat, which again exposes government weakness. This war, along with long seething tensions, like class tensions, boils over in the Revolution of 1905. Bloody Sunday, a massacre by Tsarist massacre against peaceful protesters by Tsarist forces results in the establishment of the Duma, or the parliament, or Russia's parliament. The strikes forced the government to make token concessions, but they're still seething discontent. So if you want to know, shorthand, what's which countries were from best to worst actually did, how they did in terms of modernization. Japan was the best, followed by Russia, Ottoman, China, and the worst being India. Although you really can't blame India that much because they were pretty much becoming a British colony at that point. So in 1759, the Europe commercial presence is limited to the port of Guangzhou in Canton. Foreign merchants are forced to deal solely with licensed Chinese firms called kohongs. The currency trade must have been silver bullion. The British East India Company was heavily involved. However, the British East India Company turns the tide against China by using the opium trade. The opium was grown in China and sold in China for silver, and the silver was used to buy other Chinese products. The Chinese population becomes addicted to opium. The trade was illegal, but the Chinese authorities are pretty crappy at enforcing. Increasing trade and social ills are evident by the late 1830s. The Chinese moved to enforce the ban for example, destroying 20,000 chests of opium. However, the British agents are able to convince the British government to engage in military retaliation. This results in the Opium War. They attack the jugular vein of China, the Grand Canal, and thus the British naval forces easily defeat the Chinese. This just shows how much China was really behind the times. China's forced into a series of unequal peace treaties, basically like their version of capitulations. The treaty in Jing, cedes Hong Kong to Britain and opens 5 ports to British traders and grants most favored nation status to Britain. Also, they're forced to acknowledge extraterritorial status to British subjects. Later, other countries conclude similar treaties or concessions. It legalized, the opium trade and Christianity were legalized, and this allowed the establishment of Christian missions and the opening of additional ports. Now now all this foreign and now in terms of internal rebellions, you have the Taiping Rebellion. The population rises 50% between 1800 and 1900 without industrialization. Many large-scale rebellions in the later 19th century reflect the poverty and discontent of the Chinese peasantry. The Taiping Rebellion is led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed test-taker and schoolteacher who called for the destruction of the Qing Dynasty and multiple radical reforms. He thought he was the little brother of Jesus. It advocated for the Taiping rebels advocated for the abolishment of private property, the creation of communal wealth, prohibition of foot binding and concubines, free public education, and simplification of the written Chinese alphabet in order to allow for mass literacy, equality of men and women, establishment of democratic political institutions, and the building of an industrial society, and the prohibition of sexual relations among followers, including married couples. But, the leaders, continued with sex anyway. I think the leader of the Taiping Rebellion had multiple... Let me see, what was his name again? Huang Xiuquan. He still had multiple harems, so whatever. So the imperial forces consisting of Manchu soldiers failed to defeat the Taipings. Rather, regional armies staffed by Chinese instead of the Manchu who were commanded by the members of the scholar gentry class and outfitted with European weapons are able to actually take them down. This rebellion ends up being a catastrophe for China, killing 20 to 30 million lives. This, unsurprisingly, leads to a very drastic decline in agricultural production. So, the Chinese attempt the self-strengthening movement, kind of their version of the Tanzimat. They were able to build some shipyards, railroads, and academies, but the change to China's economy and society were superficial, as it did not bring real military and economic strength. It didn't help that Empress Dowager Cixi diverted funds for her own aesthetic purposes. So, a sphere of influence is a district in which a foreign power had exclusive trade, transportation, and mineral rights. The Qing Dynasty loses influence in Southeast Asia and loses tributary states to Europe and Japan. Vietnam to France, Burma to Great Britain, Korea, Taiwan, and the Liaodong Peninsula into Japan. China itself is divided into spheres of influence. Emperor Guangxu attempts to implement reforms, instituting constitutional government, guarantee civil liberties, public education, military improvements, European economic advancements. However, this produced a violent conservative reaction from the members of the imperial house, gentry, and the empress. The empress nullifies the reforms, imprisons the emperor, and executes 6 leading reformers. The Cixi supports the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, aka the Boxers, who are anti-foreign militia units. In 1899, they fight to rid China of the foreign devils, and go on a rampage killing foreigners and Chinese Christians. They believe Europeans will not harm them, haha, very funny, and the Boxers are able to besiege European embassies in 1900. However, they are crushed by a coalition of European forces. China is forced to accept the stationing of foreign troops, including in the capital city of Beijing. Emperor and the empress die, both die, and 2-year-old Puyi is placed on the throne but does not get to rule because of the rule of Revolution 1911. Sadly, Puyi ends up becoming a Japanese puppet later on. So this basically helps explain why China is so obsessed with sovereignty and Xi Jinping is, trying to become more authoritarian. Basically, China is very terrified of going back to being caught up into spheres of influence once again. Now, Japan was the only one able to succeed in actually modernizing. Japanese society was in chaos in the early 19th century due to poor agriculture output, famines, and high taxes. The daimyo samurai classes decline, the peasants starve. The Tokugawa government attempts conservative reforms from 1841 to 1843. However, cancels, for example, by canceling daimyo and samurai debts owed to merchants and abolishing merchant guilds. This compelled peasants to return to cultivating rice. Reforms are ineffective, and the reformer that advised the shogun is driven from office. Europeans and the Americans attempt to establish relations. However, the Japanese are very restrictive, only allowing Dutch presence in Nagasaki, until Admiral Matthew Perry arrives in 1853 suddenly and shocks Japan. Basically, he sails a gunship to Tokyo and forces Japan to open its ports or risk getting annihilated. So when the Russians, Britain, and the French join in and force the Tokugawa government to sign unequal treaties. They lost control of tariffs and granted extraterritorial rights to foreigners. The Japanese were pissed off as hell about this and overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate. You have a brief but decisive war between imperial and Tokugawa forces. Basically, the motto of the imperial forces was revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. In 1868, the Meiji Emperor takes power. This was the return to imperial government after 7 centuries of military rule. The Meiji Restoration sought to bring prosperity and strength to Japan, with their motto being "Rich country, strong army." And the Meiji Restorationists resolved to learn Western technology to modernize Japan for defensive purposes. So more people. Under the Meiji government, more people go to U.S. and Europe to learn. They argue for the adoption of Western legal practices and technology. They remove privileges for the daimyo and abolish the samurai class, and instead replace it with a conscript army. Now, this does lead to a brief samurai rebellion, but it's crushed by the national army. Tax reforms are implemented, having the payment being in cash rather than grain. The government taxed according to farming potential, which forced poor producers to sell to more efficient producers. Japan becomes a constitutional monarchy. It's dressed up as a gift from the emperor. However, the constitution comes from Germany, not exactly from autocratic Germany. Not exactly the best role model, if you ask me. But the emperor could disregard the recommendations of the Diet, the legislative body, and he appointed the prime minister. Some of the cabinet ministers had to be approved by the army and the navy. So basically, the army and the navy could just destroy an entire cabinet, and government. Individual rights were affirmed, but made secondary to the needs of the state. the society was very conservative, with only 5% of the male population allowed to vote in the 1890 election. This was based on property qualifications. Economic reforms are implemented to promote rapid industrialization. There's also the system of education is improved, leading to dramatic improvements in literacy tests. You also have this with girls being in schools too. The government establishes corporations, which are then sold to private investors, leading to the rise of zaibatsus, or family financial cliques. This model of government directed corporations would become the economic development model for many other countries to come in Asia, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and China. Most capital is extracted from the brutalized peasants and workers. And it worked. Extraterritoriality is ended in 1899. They crushed China in 1895 and crushed Russia in 1905. They were titled as honorary Europeans. And thank you for watching.